Great. If you could get us start off, and if you could introduce yourself and your affiliation, please.
Thank you. My name's Elsa Dawson. I'm a gender and development specialist, and I do gender-related evaluations. And my question to the panel is, have you come up with any good, effective and innovative ideas for evaluating gender and diversity sensitively, and particularly in the area of changes in power relations, which is so crucial to understand and requires really nuanced contextual understanding and information?
Great. A few more questions?
Hello, my name is Oscar Franklin. I'm from Age International. I have a comment rather than a question, which is just that so much of the difficulties with evaluation and impact evaluation in particular stem from our 3 to 5 year project funding model. It's very difficult to find a funder who is willing to let you go back into an area 2, 3, 5 years later to look at those temporarily distant impacts. The thing that jumps out of the OECD definition is the word long term. And the only time I've seen the socially distant and temporarily distant impacts that, to use Rick's phraseology, is in a strategic relationship with an organization that lasted for 15 years. Mm-hmm. And an impact that could never have been predicted, but really substantially changed the lives of beneficiaries in that area. And I think as a sector, that's a bit of a blind spot for us.
We had another question? Okay.
Hi, thanks. Emily Rogers from the British Red Cross Performance and Accountability Advisor. I guess as everyone was speaking, the thing that came to mind is you talked a lot about evaluation utilization and how to improve usage. But I guess what I'm struggling with is, how do we decide that an evaluation has been well used? You know, are we starting at such a low level that if anyone does anything with the evaluation results, then that's great, that's success? Or should we be aspiring for a bit more? But then what is the more and how do we define it? And I know that, Laura, in your presentation, you said that you'd seen an increase in utilization, and I was just wondering what it was you saw that sort of led to that conclusion.
Maybe we'll take one more question and then I'll have the panelists respond.
Hi, Dan Rittman from THET. I want to just mention something. Maybe this is more of a comment as well. The interesting. If I talk in terms of the results chain that Simon put up, I mean, obviously the kind of measuring sort of activities and outputs is the easy bit, and what we're really interested in is impact. But of course, that isn't really true. Measuring outputs and activities is not necessarily easy at all. Actually, if you're dealing with complex projects, lots of strands, lots of different places, lots of things that don't necessarily evolve in the way that you expect them to, measuring what seems like from an academic point of view or an analytical point of view, a design point of view, is the really basic, easy data that you're just going to measure and and then get onto the interesting stuff. Like how many people have turned up to do something? How many people have you interacted with? That's really challenging sometimes, and synthesizing that is really challenging. And there's, of course, a trade-off. It's in a way, it's not that hard to address these challenges, but there's a trade-off. You haven't got unlimited resources. And so, you get donors may, for instance, be, expecting you to simultaneously be measuring in great detail all the activities you're doing, all the immediate outputs, and trying to get into the impact, the meaning. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. So I guess I just wanted to throw that in and just see if you've got any thoughts on balancing those things.
Great. I think the questions and the comments that you've raised so far, again, are kind of voicing persistent challenges that I think people have recognized time and again, yet we still keep confronting them. So this question around gender sensitive, how you measure power changes in power relations, what are appropriate timeframes to be assessing different types of things, and how does that work with funding to be able to funding, I suppose, and I think Rick's point too, in terms of if staff are changing, we could perhaps have the luxury of doing 15 years, but how much institutional memory is around for that time. So quite an interesting question about kind of appropriate and feasible timeframes for evaluation. I really like this question about what is good use. In our program here at Rapid does a lot on research evidence into policy, and I think that's a really good question to push us on. Is it just the number of downloads or the number of people that have looked at evaluations, but what actually is good use? And then the final question around another kind of prioritization challenge, how much of kind of do we need to get the basics right, and what's the mix between outputs, outcomes, and if we can do impact. So what I think I'll do is we'll go down the panel and have each of you respond to the ones that potentially you have specific examples or some questions or thoughts, and then we'll come back again to the audience.
Thanks, everyone. Really good questions. Just to mention quickly, Elsa, on the gender question, I won't try and answer it myself because I don't have much experience. But we are publishing a paper quite soon on looking at gender in impact evaluation. And Emily, the question on use, I find that a fascinating question as well, because I think evaluations are knowledge products, and yet we don't have often a communications plan or a use strategy for evaluations. We do evaluations and then we hand them over and leave them to the commissioners or to do something with. But I think certainly a lot of the evaluations that are funded through 3IE now have to think about how they want to see these evaluations being used in policy. So there's two things. So first is like use in policy, and I think there are some ways, just as we think about use of any kind of knowledge product in policy, there are ways of understanding how what kinds of changes are being sort of stimulated by that knowledge product. So we have a thing called the ROMA guide, the Rapid Outcome Mapping Approach, which you can find on our website, and that's all about planning, implementing and monitoring an engagement strategy really around knowledge products. But then there's use in organisations and the use within the organisation who's commissioning the evaluation. And I think not enough is done on the behalf of the commissioners to think about how their M&E is being used, not just evaluations that are being commissioned, but their own monitoring. I was involved in a study conducted by Oxfam America a few years ago. They wanted to learn across similar organisations, campaigning organisations. So they asked them lots of questions about their M&E practices. And one of the questions was, do you have any stories of where your M&E has actually fed back into better campaigns? And there were very, very few stories. There was very little systematic learning about how their M&E is actually being used. So I think that's definitely something we can do more on.
Thank you. I don't know if I can really answer your question on gender either, but I do know that, in all the TORs we put out for evaluations within DFID, we always ask for them to be gender sensitive. And I don't think it's quite clear really what we mean by that. And, we'll get proposals back with a certain number of days allocated to a gender expert, but really what does that mean? And, how does that person really feed into the design, the collection and the analysis? So, again, if anyone else has any thoughts on that, it would be great to hear them. In terms of the question on uptake and what do we mean, or what did I mean by better uptake, I think I meant more at the local level, at the country level. We were seeing an increase in more kind of process evaluations and what we might call performance evaluations, especially around pilots of projects. And because, we really started to see more kind of evaluation champions within offices, I think people just felt a lot more kind of engaged with the findings, and they were using them on a very localised level. But kind of reflecting one of Rick's comments about actually, what does that mean around kind of the wider use of evidence? And I guess one thing I didn't mention in the presentation was it's not just trying to encourage people to use evaluation findings. We're also really trying to encourage our program managers and advisors to really look at the evidence base at the outset of programs. And there's different ways of doing that, and one of them is actually working through our advisory cadres. But, you know, I don't think we've quite got it right yet. And just to pick up on Simon's point around, trying to find examples of where M&E findings have been fed into campaigns or programs. You know, I've also worked on the NGO kind of implementer side myself, and I felt the same. You know, as a researcher and evaluator, we've kind of really worked really hard to get a piece of research done and analysed and written up, but then you find, oh, it's actually too late to inform the programming. So I think it's going back to the point, we need to be a bit more realistic and pragmatic about actually, you know, how we're monitoring and how we're feeding that back.
Yeah, maybe I can just add to that point that I think maybe it's also a question about how do organizations actually make decisions. It might be the M&E is actually quite good, but how do managers make decisions? And there I think, your point about having well thought through and clear processes for how do you pick up your findings from your evaluations and ensure that they are fed into strategy processes. We have an annual review process in DRC where each year some days are set aside for the management of each country operation to sit down and actually look at some of our lessons learned when they decide where to go next with our program. So I think it's about creating room for the use of evaluation. But then I would also like to say, I think with the idea about what is then good use of an evaluation or M&E data, to me I think it's okay that that's a kind of an open question. You can. Maybe we shouldn't try to define it all too hard. There can be many uses of this. And often, as we have seen a lot of times with, for instance, our real-time review process, the process has a lot of benefits when it creates debate, when it helps organizations like us discuss myths around when are we successful and when are we not. When do we actually have a successful program, and what does that mean? So I think it's been very helpful for those things. And leading on from that thought, I'm thinking in regards to the high turnover, that's an essential challenge in an organization like us. And even when you talk about maybe 3-year funding cycles or 3-year funding, we normally deal with half-year, 1-year project funding. So staff turnover there is a key challenge. But I wouldn't say, again, maybe we have too high ambitions about our evaluation sometimes. Is that something that evaluation should fix? I would say that may be more an organizational knowledge management issue, where you go in and you try to organize your organization in a way that expertise is picked up at a higher level and it's fed down through the training, through the way we organize our operations. Evaluations can support that, but it cannot fix the problem in itself.
Any takers on the time frame question? What you raised is kind of my ideal evaluation research study that I've always wanted to do, is to go back somewhere, because we talk a lot about sustainability, and then we measure it while programs are still ongoing or immediately after they've finished. And I would love to be able to go back in 10 years later and see, what's changed. But do any of our panelists, I see additional hands shooting up, but before we take another round, do any of our panelists have any comments, or Rick, on the time frame issue?
I think it's quite hit and miss. There's some donors are quite good at every now and then commissioning evaluations that look back over time. One of the cases that we were involved in, funded by Australian Aid, was about infrastructure in the Pacific, and that was looking over 5 years, was it 10 years, of investments. And that was very much looking at a cross-portfolio, so not just a program evaluation, but a whole portfolio evaluation. And then we're involved in another evaluation commissioned by NORAD to look at 10 years' worth of their advocacy support. So, there are some attempts at doing this. I think it's quite hit and miss, though.
Can I add a comment in? I mean, my immediate response was to be quite negative and say it's all to do with turnover of staff. Nobody's interested in what somebody else did before they turned up. That's a very broad generalisation, of course. But there is some cases of positive deviance of the kind that Simon's just pointed out. And I think it would be really interesting to look at those cases if we could find a number of them, saying what were the conditions that led to those things happening? Because sure as hell we want more of them, or some people want more of them.
Great. I saw a couple hands shoot up in the back, so maybe we'll take those too. But before we get to those, I wanted to include a question from our online audience. So Lizzie Whitehead, who's the M&E lead at Practical Action, her question is that we deliver most of our work through Southern-based partners. As donor expectations rise around the quality of evaluations, how can we build in a donor reality check around INGOs who are attempting to build capacity for evaluation while delivering programs? So I think that's an additional layer onto what Miko was saying in terms of both people involved in evaluations are both responsible for delivery, but if capacity building is also an aim, that's another kind of layer to add into the mix. So let's take a few more questions.
Right. My name's Edward Mallory, and I've been involved over many years in doing a wide range of monitoring and evaluation work. And regarding this issue of the long-term impact, there was a cycle of projects in Bangladesh, in fact still going on, funded by Asian Development Bank and by other donors, whereby this was to do with water resource improvement, irrigation, drainage, etc. And the cycle was, after a 5-year project, the end of the 5-year project, you did a baseline, and at the end of the next 5-year project, you did an impact evaluation of the previous 5 years. So in other words, until a project was 5 years closed, you didn't do an impact evaluation. Now, this was interesting, but in my mind, it didn't really work, because once you change water resources, you get some very quick changes in farming patterns. And this could happen before the 5 years is up. You've built a new drain, and the next season, you've got an enormous impact. So I'm a bit skeptical about this business of long-term impact. I think often I recall another evaluation done in Nepal of a DFID-funded work on agricultural research, where a team came in 10 years after and found, well, everybody actually, many of them had stopped farming. They'd moved into urban sector, they'd moved on to different things altogether. It was very useful for a while in their livelihood portfolio, but after a while they've adapted to new ideas. Anyway, that's my thought.
Thanks for that comment.
Three very quick. Claire Thomas, Minority Rights Group. I'm a Deputy Director there and I commission evaluations. So 3 very quick comments. I would like to defend long-term evaluations. We did one that looked at work 7 to 12 years previously, CEDA funded Central and Eastern Europe. It was an area we'd exited out of. My word of caution is that causality, contribution and attribution becomes extremely dubious at that time frame, particularly in our case when you're looking at policy and advocacy legal work. So the number of interlocutors just multiplies, and how can you claim it's a result of your work after that period of time? I'm sorry I missed the beginning, but I was really intrigued to hear about this over-promising. It's something an evaluator said to us, and it certainly is something that's kind of outside our control. So I'd be really interested if there was a bit of a discussion about that here today. And there's one other point, but it's gone out of my head. So,
thanks for those 2 comments. Maybe we'll take 2 more questions. Here in front.
Good afternoon. Megan Kennedy Schwan. I'm from the Children's Investment Fund Foundation here in London. I commission evaluations as well, formerly OECD DAC. So I just wanted to thank all of the panelists and the audience members as well. It's just a really relevant conversation. And I often get the impression that sort of everything has been evaluated, but not everyone has evaluated it. And so I wonder in this question about use, how much, I mean, it's a hard enough problem to get learning shared within an organization across countries or across programs or sectors. But then, you know, how much does the branding of an evaluation also affect? So if DFID has an evaluation, you know, does it matter that Canada, CEDA, has done the same evaluation, but it has the Canadian flag on the cover instead of the Union Jack? So if you could maybe talk about that, not only in the public sector context, but also in the Danish Refugee Council, for example, is how do you deal with that kind of proprietary approach to evaluations that it just feels like there's so much evidence out there and we keep making the same mistakes over and over and over, and yeah, how can we try and overcome that? Thanks.
One final question for this round. There's a mic behind you as well.
Hi, I'm Lydia Richardson from Triple Line Consulting. I mainly do evaluations, but occasionally I'm evaluated. So I'm very interested in evaluations of challenge funds. That's one of the areas we specialise in. And DFID recently asked us to do a very short piece of research on evaluability of challenge funds. And there was actually a lack of evidence on that subject. And it's a very complex issue. It touches on all sort of portfolio level evaluations. And there's lots of tensions between, who is evaluating and who, in the layers of challenge fund, you have often an evaluation manager, a fund manager, and then the projects. And all actors have different levels of responsibility. I just wanted to know from the panelists if they'd ever had any experience on this subject. And a slightly linked question, but a broader question, is the tensions between evaluation and accountability and evaluation and learning. So is an evaluation about learning? Should it be done, therefore, during the programme rather than at the end? Or is it about accountability, in which case it's more likely to be done at the end of the programme? Thank you.
Great. A great set of questions. Let me see if I can capture them all. So we have to remember our online question around capacity. And so the donor reality check around INGOs who are attempting to build capacity for evaluation while delivering programs. So a question around that. A question around challenge funding and the tensions between accountability and learning, and how does that affect the timing of when evaluations are done. This question around kind of the meta level of learning. So moving up from how can we learn across projects and across countries, but then how do we learn across organizations and institutions, and what are the implications of that in terms of confidentiality and potentially in terms of institutionalization and use, because I think often use might be highest if things are kept internal, because then people can be more candid, but then how do you reconcile that with Rick's suggestion around, can we collectively make better use of all of this data that's being collected in our kind of respective learning, and do so publicly. Laura, can we start with you?
Yes. So I'll try to answer the question around capacity building of 7 organisations by INGOs. I really wish my colleague, who's the evaluation market manager, was here to answer this, because he could speak a lot better to it than I can. I think we are coming to a realisation within DFID that some of the TORs or some of the asks that we're putting out for evaluation, are unrealistic. And yes, of course, it makes sense that we're asking our suppliers to build the capacity of 7 and local organisations. Although I think we do need to realise that this is probably more suitable on some evaluations as opposed to others. And kind of going back to the prioritisation work we're doing, in terms of looking at these kind of, what we might see as more important organisations from a corporate perspective, they're probably not the evaluations, but maybe we should be asking partners to be doing that. I can only feed this back to my colleagues in the evaluation department. But yeah, I think also we need partners and our suppliers to be honest to us about what you can do and what you can't do. And we probably need to be asking more questions around, actually, if we're asking you to build a capacity, how exactly are you going to do that?
Mikkel, any thoughts?
I maybe have a few thoughts on the learning, on lessons unlearned, or what we could call it. That we often have this, that our evaluations and our reviews, they point out the same issues over and over again. And I guess they point to that, of course, there are some systemic challenges as well that are maybe not always addressed immediately after the evaluation report is there. Or maybe the evaluation report points out the problem, but then we need to find a solution as well. So of course it takes time sometimes to change. And again, especially with systemic issues, if it might even be some of the things related to the sector, there's a longer horizon then for changing these things. So I think I don't see it necessarily as a problem that some of our evaluation reports come out and restate some of the same things. It can also be a help to keep focus on some of the challenges that we do have and keep them on the agenda in some way. So I think it's a really interesting issue, this thing about balancing accountability objectives versus learning when you do conduct and go into evaluations. I think it's a really, really interesting issue. I think from my side and my experience within DRC, I think, we are trying to, when we talk about building the evaluation capacity, we are talking a lot about making more relevant use and more strategic use of evaluations, and doing a little bit away with a lot of the autopilot, so to speak, or ad hoc evaluations. So a lot of our evaluations that are done because it's accountability demand, it seems that sometimes we don't maybe invest that much in them. We maybe sometimes invest more if it's something that's come out of either bottom up from the field. We have this pilot project that is really interesting and we think we might have some good results here we should pick up or look at. Or it might be a management decision that this is a really interesting aspect of the developments within our organization. Let's look at that. That there you tend to be able to build more momentum, build more focus, and therefore also maybe gain more in terms of the added value of the evaluation as such, I would say.
Simon, any thoughts on tensions between accountability and learning?
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic, I think. Comes up a lot. But I like the way that I think it's Irene Hoyt, who she's the one who's part of the team who put together the Big Push Forward events in the last couple of years and just published a book recently. But she talks a lot about not just thinking about these ideas as two separate things, but thinking about learning for accountability. So actually trying to build the learning function as part of the accountability to various stakeholders. But also using accountability and all of the sort of functions associated with accountability as part of learning as well. So just seeing them more as tied together rather than in tension. Can I respond to the other questions as well?
You can.
So I think that the capacity development question is quite relevant. I mean, as a research organisation, we've had the same sort of tension for years in terms of donors wanting to work with consortia of northern and southern research organisations, but obviously having a sort of a explicit capacity building element to that. And it's only recently now that I'm seeing research programs with log frames that have particular outputs which refer to building capacity of team members. So I think if there can be something similar for evaluations, that part of the objective of the evaluation goes beyond just producing high quality, but also building capacity, then that's probably a useful way to go. Edward, I think your story really sort of highlights the need for a sort of a contextual understanding of impact and sort of having that based on a sensible look at the theory of change. You know, how is change expected to happen in this context, and using that as a guide for what does impact mean in this situation. And then sort of the Megan's question about learning across donors. There's a lot of useful work going on at the moment on systematic reviews. I think it's the Campbell collaboration that are funding a lot of these, that they're trying to learn across sort of bodies of knowledge that have been developed over time. I think that they have quite strict criteria on which studies get included and which don't. So I think if there can be something similar that has a more broader remit at looking at evaluations across donor agencies on similar sectors, then that could be quite useful.
Thanks. And that actually answers another question that came in online around wondering, would a universal database of projects and lessons learned on them organized by donor and sector be completely unthinkable? So hopefully we can move more towards, I mean, there are things that exist, but hopefully we can continue to develop them. So we are running short on time, so let's take 2 more questions, and then we have another hour outside where we can continue these conversations around time frame over wine. So let's do 2 more questions in the room, and then I'll have the panelists give final concluding remarks. So here in front, and then...
I'm David Fleming from ITAD. I'm not sure this is working. I think you can hear me anyway. We're an M&E consultancy based in Brighton. I just want to pick up on something both Simon and Rick talked about in terms of different understandings of impact. Simon, you framed sort of the thinking about impact as kind of reconciling the OECD and the 3IE definitions. I think the question of impact should also be framed around reconciling different understandings of impact and different uses of impact data and evidence by different stakeholders. So I think, Rick, it links to your point about this kind of pluralist view of impact. So you have implementers and program managers who want to understand what works and why, or why not, and when something's not working, to learn and to adapt. But I guess you have senior leaders in government, on the other hand, tend to want to hear the top-level messages. You know, what have we achieved with our investment? Often less interested in hearing about complexity, want to see quick impacts, but sometimes don't understand themselves what they mean when they're asking for implementers to report on impact. What are your views on how you reconcile these different views of impact? You know, supporting pluralist views, but at the same time making sure we all speak the same language. And if I could sort of offer potentially one solution, I guess it's probably incumbent on M&E practitioners and M&E champions themselves to help bridge that gap, to help implementers understand, you know, what is meaningful data to collect, you know, to help kind of Mikhail's 6,000 actually be collecting the right data, useful data, not meaningless data, to be able to present, you know, kind of narratives around results to donors, but also to help policymakers and donors understand what they mean when they're asking about impact and what they want implementers to provide. So, yeah, I think it's a kind of, what are your views on reconciling those different understandings of impact?
Great. And one final question here.
Thank you. My name is Cecilia, and I'm a student at the LSE. And my question sort of echoes the previous question. And it's about the, I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on the current drive towards evidence-based policymaking and the rise of accountability. And it sort of links with the debate of around making what is important measurable rather than making what is measurable important. And I was wondering whether you were worried that with the current drive for accountability, we were favoring the demonstration of impact through sometimes imperfect methods that might be favoring short-term impacts rather than long-term, and whether what is being evaluated is meaningful in any way.
Great. I feel like now we're just getting into kind of the meat of these discussions. But yeah, again, hopefully these will continue in the next hour and outside of this room. So maybe Rick will come to you first, and then Simon, your thoughts on how to reconcile different conceptions of impact and how to bridge across different audiences and kind of users and people with different functions. And then this question around increasing drives for accountability and implications of that for evidence-based policymaking.
I think on how to reconcile the different views of impact, I'd go along the line, I think, where Simon was taking us, which is the answer must be, to some extent, context-specific. Now, that sounds like an escape clause, but I think if you're an evaluation consultant, you would be arguing that in this particular context, these are the appropriate ways to look at impact, and this is why. So there'd be some transparent reasoning as to why you were taking that particular angle in that particular context. I was thinking, it reminded me when you were saying that about Lydia's reference to the evaluation of challenge funds, which I think is a really interesting issue. in that setting, I would say I would not look at temporally distant impacts. I would not look at socially distant impacts. In that setting, because there is a whole chain of actors involved in delivering the aid, I would say let us focus on the value added by the manager of the Challenge Fund, and let us make that the boundary. It's a sort of outcome mapping approach. So let's look at the immediate actors that DFID is working with, and what value they are adding to this process. In terms of selecting fundable projects, in terms of capacity building, in terms of communicating findings. So that would be a sort of an example of a sort of context-specific approach to selecting one angle on impact. In terms of the other question over here, I think I wouldn't overemphasize how important these trends in what is important in evaluation are. I think a lot of these things are like sort of swells that they just move over us and pass on in the fullness of time, and a lot of practice remains essentially largely unchanged or influenced by a multiplicity of other factors that don't give the same amount of publicity. So I'd say relax.
Simon, your thoughts?
Yeah, reconciling different perspectives. I mean, I think there's kind of two issues. There's one is just being clear on the language and being, and I would, open up a conversation about those 6 different dimensions and see, okay, what do you actually mean when you're talking about impact? Then the other one is that there are actually different questions that are wanting to be answered by policymakers and by program managers, and this isn't something that needs to be reconciled. They just, it's just a fact that they need different information to answer different questions. And, I think a lot of problems arise when systems get sort of merged together to try and tackle everything all together. And let's just keep them separate, A lot of the job of managing contractors is to do that, is to make sure the people, who they report to get the information they need, but also that the people they are supporting on the ground are not overburdened with the information requirements coming from above. So it's kind of that dual layer, that there's frameworks for implementation and frameworks for more policy decision making. And I think the question about rise of accountability, I think we all just need to be more sort of open and honest about the methods we're using, the questions we're asking, and the reasons we're doing that. And if we can have open conversations about why is this evaluation being commissioned, why are we being asked to collect this kind of data, and why are we choosing this particular method, then a lot of those tensions will alleviate.
The title of this session was called Unpacking Evaluation Challenges. And I think our panelists gave us some excellent food for thought in terms of some initial challenges. I think you all have uncovered additional challenges. I think Mikael's point that it's one thing to identify a problem or a challenge, but it's another to find a solution is really an important note to end on. And I think for me, a big theme that has really run across all of these challenges is really one about balance. So how do we balance short-term questions and answers with longer-term big development questions? How do we get the time frame right? How do we link project level and strategic processes within and across organizations? How much should be decentralized versus centralized? And really figuring out that balance for projects and programs. I think often the answer is it depends, and it's context dependent. And I think perhaps that's why we both recognize that's true, but I think that potentially is our source of frustration too, because it would be so much easier if there was an easy answer and that would work across multiple settings. So as we move into into the more relaxed social portion and continue the conversations. I think learning from each other around where the balance has lie in different settings and different conditions is really how we can collectively move forward. So before we let everyone loose on the wine, I want to give the panelists the final word to give a few closing reflections. But before we do that, I just want to point out that a number of resources do exist. So I would encourage everyone to go to these websites. Simon mentioned we have a number of Methods Lab papers coming out, including his on what is impact. We have a designing impact-oriented monitoring and evaluation systems guidance note, a gender guidance note. ALNAP has a number of guidance tools around using OECD DAC criteria in humanitarian evaluations, doing RTEs, facilitating use, and has a number of evaluation guidance on evaluation of humanitarian action and humanitarian protection coming out in early 2016. So stay tuned for all of those and use the resources that exist. And before I turn to the panelists, I want to first say a huge thank you to all of you for being here and contributing to the conversation. Thank you to our online audience who have participated. And a huge thanks for everyone who helped put this together. So Tina, Amanda, Louise, and Josephine from Rapid, Francesca, we miss you, Alex Warner, Alex, Glenn, Chloe, and Paul from ALNAP, Rebecca, Hannah, and Jess from the ODI communications team, Rob and Josh for their stellar technical support with no glitches, which is amazing, and Sergio and Alice from facilities. So with that, final closing reflections.
Yes, thank you. I think just picking up on the last discussion here on the evidence push and accountability, I think maybe some of you know that there's this Danish professor that's looked into evaluations called Dahl Larsen, who wrote this book on evaluation society and talks about evaluation mania in our countries today. And I think, looking from a humanitarian perspective, humanitarian organization, I think there's definitely, we can improve a lot of our work around evaluations, and there's of course a need for a lot more knowledge on what works and what doesn't. So I think there's a lot of benefits in this push and in this focus. But at the same time, I think, as I've been trying to highlight here, I think there is also a need at the same time to manage expectations around evaluations. So we don't see evaluations as something that can fix all our problems, because they can point to some of them and they can help us improve some of the processes, but there are definitely a lot of the challenges we have outside the scope of evaluations. So with that, I'll end as well. Thank you.
I think just two quick thoughts from me, really. I think this discussion around different types of impact, how we actually conceptualize impact, is really interesting, and I don't think we're having this discussion enough within DFID, and that's partially because we do have our institutional frameworks and we need some consistency of definition, for example, for our log frames, although to what extent we actually use them consistently, I'm not sure. I think we need to get better at thinking about this at the programme design stage, which kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about actually, again, how we're using evidence. We talk about evaluation, but actually a lot of this has to be done at the very outset and thinking about, different impacts on different groups at that stage. So this is definitely something I'll take away with me. Also, I think within DFID, we are still in a bit of a period of transition, like really, trying to move away from being very much on the kind of RCT side of the fence and really looking at, how can we be expanding on our methods and, how can we actually improve our understanding of when we can be using different methods and approaches. So hopefully, again, this is something we're getting better at. And in terms of the kind of unrealistic expectations, as I said before, I think, we're increasingly realising that sometimes we do have unrealistic expectations, but just to stress again, we really need our suppliers and our partners to be quite honest about, what you can do. And I think increasingly we're using early market engagement, when we're considering doing an evaluation. And we don't always, we get feedback from our suppliers, but it's not always as useful as it could be. So do use that as a real opportunity to feed back to us.
I'll be short. I think the discussions here have sort of demonstrated that there's more of a need for more research on evaluation. And there's a great paper written by Patricia Rogers, who's the founder of Better Evaluation, proposing a research agenda on evaluation, which I think is well worth reading if you're interested in that. But I think, it's an open invitation for anyone to join us. I think it would be fantastic if there was more systematic learning between donors, NGOs, consulting firms and evaluators on some of these issues.
So with that, here's to collectively breaking the conspiracy together and to experimenting and learning together. Thanks, everyone.